How did Britain become so dependent on selling arms? It really all began here on the Tyne, where these empty shipyards used to build half the world's battleships. A century ago, much of the wealth of Newcastle depended on the guns and warships which were sold round the world, competing with Krupps in the first great arms race. It was all started by William George Armstrong. After beginning as a lawyer in Newcastle, he taught himself to be an engineer. In 1847, he bought 5½ acres of land along the River Tyne, close to Newcastle, near a village called Paradise. In these rural surroundings, he built workshops for his first great invention, a hydraulic crane. The orders flowed in, and Armstrong turned his mind to more exciting challenges. During the Crimean War in 1854, he was shocked by the archaic British weapons, and he designed a revolutionary new gun with a rifle barrel. It was accepted, and soon Armstrong was selling all kinds of weapons to the world, from warships to machine guns. The Gatling gun, 500 rounds a minute. A giant gun mounted on railway tracks. A 110-ton gun, which in turn gave way to big naval guns. Armstrong even began making armoured cars, which later evolved into tanks. With the huge profits of his arms business, Lord Armstrong built himself an extravagant mansion, now bequeathed to the National Trust, which he called Cragside. There I asked the present Lord Armstrong how his ancestor first became involved in the arms trade.
We were entering a technological age, and that places like Woolwich Arsenal were still glorified blacksmith shops. And therefore, in order to defend our country and our empire, we had to produce weapons, right. Then the government found that it couldn't afford to equip itself, because they suddenly realized that you needed to maintain the infrastructure of the business and the concentration of skills. You couldn't sack 10,000 people one year and re-engage them the next, just because the War Minister decided he didn't want to have any pea shooters.
And so Armstrong had to export his guns and battleships to keep his business going. And the world came to Newcastle to buy arms. The King of Siam, the Shah of Persia, Chinese, Japanese, they all left their marks in his visitor's book.
What we were doing was to preserve the Pax Britannica, which was a good thing. And if we had not had resources of this kind in the country, we would have been nobbled by others. I mean, we just wouldn't have survived as long as we have.
And then came the First World War. The war turned Tyneside, like other arms regions, into a hive of activity. The shipyards and gun shops which Lord Armstrong had established were now overflowing with workers making weapons, not now for foreigners, but for the British war effort. But with peace, the boom turned suddenly into a disastrous slump. No one now wanted guns or warships, or even merchant ships in the long depression. There was a strike at Armstrong's in 1926 when management tried to introduce a cut in wages. The men of Newcastle found themselves on the breadline. Armstrong's company, after some disastrous investments, was merged with Vickers, but the depression deepened. Tyneside was only saved by the Second World War. With the end of the war, British arms companies once again turned to selling abroad to keep their factories open.
In the end, of course, it's been disastrous, because now, take first the post-World War II situation, we're exporting not so much for our own defense as for the economic health of the country, and the same with most of the Western powers. And it's very ominous, because there we are, heading down the slope and sowing the seeds of our own destruction.
Tyneside today still looks to this fickle world trade for part of its prosperity. Middle East buyers now come to Newcastle to order more tanks and equipment. Newcastle now needs the Middle East to keep its arms factories busy. They're now busier than at any time since the Second World War. Armoured recovery vehicles are made and tested at Vickers' own proving ground. 70 are being sold to Iran, costing £500,000 each. What's the attitude of Newcastle workers? At the Chieftain pub, which has a bar in the shape of a tank, I talked to some Vickers men, including the works convener, Jim Murray.
Workers would rather work on arms than be on the door.
Right.
But personally, I would prefer, certainly the shop stewards would prefer to see us, not just from a kind of moral point of view, but also from a point of view of, some kind of security of work. Because from 20,000 working there in 1946, we're now down to, in Elsick itself, like, under 2,000 people. So there's no security. We haven't made a good living out of arms in terms of continuity of employment. We are putting forward ideas for commercial products because we see this as offering, some kind of continuity of work. If you could defence, we can make these products which are of some use to people, as opposed to weapons of mass destruction.
What do you think the attitude of Vickers really is to Newcastle and to the arms business here?
Well, I think it's a bit of an embarrassment that I think they'd like to have closed Newcastle down. There's no new product ever come to Newcastle in the last 20 years, none whatsoever. It's all been taken away. And of course the works is dwindling, and the whole economy of the West End of Newcastle, which at one time depended upon Vickers for the livelihood, is now kind of running down, and huge areas of dereliction outside the pub. Very high unemployment rate, very high crime rate in the West End of Newcastle.
Newcastle in 1978 is still paying the price for its early arms prosperity. There's high unemployment and continuing depression and decay. Is the arms trade really so healthy for the economy? I talked to Mary Caldor, an economist who's made a special study of the effects of arms on Newcastle.
This area was really built in the first industrial revolution. It was the centre of shipbuilding and heavy engineering. And from the last quarter of the 19th century, companies like Vickers and like Swan Hunters further up along the Tyne became dependent on arms. And essentially the effect was to freeze the industrial and social structure in the mid-19th century. Arms no longer guarantee jobs. The arms industry itself isn't immune to the effects of modern technology, and increasingly more and more of a Chieftain tank, for example, consists of complex electronic equipment, and that really means that more and more jobs are being shifted from the traditional engineering industries.
With this tremendously long tradition of making arms here, can you really visualize them switching to other products away from arms?
I think it's incredibly difficult for them precisely because they've never had to adapt for the last 100 years.
Could we switch, for instance, from making tanks to tractors here?
Well, this is of course one of the things that they did, and one of the things that was a terrific failure, and it was a failure basically because they built tractors in rather the same way that they built tanks. Tanks, for example, don't have to be reliable because battles don't last very long. It's terribly important that you build reliable tractors. And so that although the tractors were, I'm told, rather efficient in terms of their working capacity, they kept breaking down, and it turned out to be very costly to mend them. This is a problem of the way they think about it.
Those chieftain tanks, they would cost about £500,000 each, wouldn't they?
Yes,
For that kind of price, you could presumably make a very large number of tractors.
That's right, and particularly if you think of the kind of sophisticated skills and ideas that go into making a chieftain tank. The workers have very much stressed not only ordinary engineering products, things like mining machinery, agricultural machinery, and various other kinds of manufacturing machinery. They're very anxious that the kinds of alternatives they make should be related to social needs. There's no doubt that to switch to new products is going to be a great effort. On the other hand, I don't really see any alternative. I don't think arms are going to maintain jobs. I mean, we've seen what a dramatic decline there's been in employment in recent years. It just isn't true that arms have served to maintain prosperity.